Good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Rodarski. I'm the city historian and the manager of the Local History and Genealogy Division, and I'm here to welcome you to Mourning in the Morning, a partnership between the Local History and Genealogy Division and the Friends of Mount Hope. I've got a couple of housekeeping issues for you. I would like to ask you to turn off your cameras during our presentation today. That will allow for better bandwidth. And also, please mute yourself during our presentation. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session. And at that point, you can go ahead and turn your cameras back off and unmute yourself. You can also enter questions in the chat area. Our session is being interpreted today by Wanya Jefferson and Sage Nagy. So if you're in need of any information, you can highlight them on your screen. Our presentation today is called Mount Hope Cemetery, an Artistic Legacy. And the program is being presented by Christopher C. Conway. And we don't see Christopher right now. I think he turned his screen off, but we will see him at the end of the presentation. Christopher is a native of rural East Texas. He grew up in the greater Houston area. He traded the Gulf Coast for the Pacific Northwest, and for the whole of the 1990s called Seattle, Washington home. He happily made his way to Rochester in 2017 and has yet to try a garbage plate. Chris, I'm with you. I've been here even longer and have not officially had a garbage plate. Chris holds a BA in art history from the University of Houston and is currently employed as an exhibition.
Well, this is the library girl.
Gallery.
There's a girl signing.
And I'm sorry, I just paused to mute everybody because I was hearing some background noise. Chris holds a BA in art history from the University of Houston and is currently employed as an exhibitions assistant at the Memorial Art Gallery. He looks constantly to indulge a lifelong love of travel and theater. And you may have caught a glimpse of him on the Rochester's local stages. If not, please keep an eye out for him. And so I am happy to present Christopher to you. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much, Christine. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I want to thank the Rochester Public Library, the Local History and Genealogy Department, as well as the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery for giving me the chance to talk to you today about the cemetery's artistic legacy. And I want to thank you for attending. I hope you find it worth your time. And speaking of time, let's not waste any more of it. Let's get to it, shall we? Once upon a time, in a far-off land along the banks of the Ikva River, in a city called Dubno, located in present-day Ukraine, there lived a little girl, and she daydreamed, and she danced, and she daydreamed. Tamarah Vishnushka, she fantasized about a ballerina's career, and at the tender age of 15, she set out for the bright lights of Warsaw in hopes of making her dream come true. And there in Warsaw, she danced. One night in 1935, after a nightclub performance, Tamarah was approached by a gentleman. He asked if she might not like to be in the movies. Young, beautiful, with a demonstrated sense of adventure. "Why, yes," replied Tamarah. "I might like very much to be in the movies." And so Tamarah became a film actress. Actually, Tamarah became a movie star, a popular star of Polish cinema. She would star in 14 movies over the course of the next 4 years and become hailed the Jeanette MacDonald of Poland. In 1937, she wed producer Władysław Mikoś, and the two had a daughter, Irene. At the age of 19, the little girl from Dubno had achieved a remarkably idyllic life. She had a glamorous career, a husband, a child, and plans for an exciting new chapter. Indeed, terms and conditions of a Hollywood contract were being finalized. Then, 3 months shy of her 20th birthday, the fairy tale came to a crashing and terrifying close. It was a short, beautiful life, she later recalled, that ended when the Germans took over Poland. With the German invasion in 1939, Tamarah and Vladislav joined the Polish underground. They would aid in a cultural resistance, a sort of soft sabotage, where they helped produce anti-German propaganda, appealing to Polish nationalism in an effort to sustain the spirit and resolve of their fellow countrymen. Tamarah sewed her jewelry into her dresses so that the family might be able to procure food and shelter in the midst of war and occupation. Her last diamond was traded for cigarettes so that she might better barter. Cigarettes and coffee were worth more than money or jewelry, she explained. At the war's end, her jewelry was gone, but her family had survived. For 5 years, they lived in a Bavarian refugee camp until at last they were able to immigrate to the US, settling into a quiet life in Rochester. There would be no more movies. Tamarah worked as a receptionist and translator for George Eastman House for 16 years before retiring. She would succumb to cancer in 1981 at the age of 61. Vladislav, who had come to be called Walter, would follow her in death 13 years later. The two are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. A pink granite marker featuring their portraits serves as memorial to the dramatic lives led by the Polish movie star and her producer husband. It's a lovely memorial, but it hardly ranks among the most artistically significant monuments that one encounters on a visit to the cemetery. Why then have I chosen to include it here? I suggest to you that the artistic legacy of Mount Hope Cemetery is not comprised solely of those obvious artistically significant monuments, but that rather that legacy is also made up of countless stories, stories of artists' lives, artists laid to rest in Mount Hope. Tamarah's is but one among countless stories. So today I want to share with you a broad survey, a wide glimpse, by no means exhaustive in scope. There's nothing comprehensive about this presentation. I want to share some of that art and some of those stories, a sampling of art found inside Mount Hope and the stories of the artists responsible. And I want to share some stories of artists who are buried in Mount Hope and show you a sampling of their artistic productions. For the purpose of this presentation, I have sought to be inclusive in my use of the term art. So as evidenced by Tamarah's story, we will not be limiting ourselves strictly to the visual fine arts of sculpture, painting, and the like, but will broaden our discussion to include artists of performance and of literature as well. Regardless of whether you have had the pleasure and privilege of a Roman holiday, you may well recognize this enormous monument, a tribute to the first king of a unified Italy, Victor Emanuele II, also referred to as the altar of the fatherland, Altare della Patria, and sometimes referred to rather cheekily as the wedding cake because of its white facade, its tiers, and its colonnades. It houses Italy's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and individual tributes to the various regions of Italy. I'd like us to focus on the left-hand side. Here's a detail to help. I'd like to direct your focus here, this figure perched atop the towering column. Here we see a winged victory with palm and serpent. The sculpture, completed in 1910, a year before the monument's inauguration, would be the final work of an accomplished and internationally renowned Italian sculptor, an artist responsible for what may arguably be the two most artistically significant monuments to be found in Mount Hope. Nicola Cantalamessa Papoti. After his tenure as a student at the Academy of St. Luke in Rome, he found service in the court of Ferdinand II, the King of the Two Sicilies. His commissions there included an 1855 sculpture depicting Saint Emedio baptizing Policia, the most important work of his youth. Commissioned by Pope Pius IX, he produced a relief to adorn the base of the column of the Immaculate Conception in Rome. Seen here, the Dream of Saint Joseph. The rendering of numerous portrait busts showcased his masterful skill in capturing the lifelike visage of human expression and personality, as well as his expert technical realization of such features as hair and the drapery of cloth. His artistry was to benefit as well from his equal savvy as a marketer of his skill. His works were given display at World's Expositions held in Philadelphia in 1876, Chicago, 1893, and St. Louis, 1904. They would garner him numerous private commissions, including a bust of President James Garfield. The great bulk of his US commissions would come in the form of funerary monuments for prominent families. Examples can be found in Buffalo, Boston, Cleveland, and Rochester. The Orson Phelps Monument in Buffalo's Forest Lawn Cemetery bears a good measure of resemblance to that winged victory we viewed at the Roman monument to Victor Emmanuele II. Holy Sepulchre Cemetery here in Rochester boasts a Papodi commission for Patrick Barry, half of the famed Rochester nursery enterprise Ellwanger and Barry. But Mount Hope is home to partner George Ellwanger's Papodi commission, an evocative depiction of St. John on the Isle of Patmos, poised to receive and record the biblical revelations. A close-up here reveals pen in hand, book at the ready, and the iconic eagle, a symbol of the saint. Also revealed in the adjacent image are the effects of harsh conditions met by such sculptural works exposed to the elements. For many years after its installation, Ellwanger and Barry nursery staff would assemble late each fall a wooden and glass frame structure to enclose the monument, protecting it from the Rochester winter. Spring came and the structure would be disassembled and removed year after year. This effort eventually ceased. Today's greatest challenge comes not from the natural elements, but from the exhaust of automobile traffic along Mount Hope Avenue. I assure you, however, St. John does not look like this today. A monument of such unique significance and importance, it receives careful cleaning, maintenance, and restoration on an annually rotating schedule with two other monuments, courtesy of the tireless efforts of the nonprofit volunteer organization, the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. The Rochester wool merchant Aaron Erickson, in attendance at the Philadelphia Exposition of 1876, was also impressed by Papodi's work. He commissioned a work for his burial plot. Papodi would carve the Weary Pilgrim in Rome, completing the work in 1882. Again, we see Papodi's attention to the detail of drapery, of hair and beard, the haggard expression. The scallop shell adorning his tunic is a symbol of St. James and was adopted by pilgrims who would wear the shell on their pilgrimage to St. James' Shrine. The Weary Pilgrim is another of the three monuments specifically included in that 3-year rotation of preservation projects. Among the works Papodi exhibited at the Philadelphia Exposition was Love's Mirror. Another Rochesterian in attendance, businessman Daniel Powers, was so taken by the work that he purchased it. A prized piece of his personal art collection, he charged the public a 25-cent admittance to view the work. One newspaper article remarked that the work possessed, quote, a grace and lifelikeliness rarely met within modern composition. Eventually acquired by the Memorial Art Gallery, it is on display. Afforded the climate-controlled interior of a museum gallery, the surface finish of Love's Mirror provides a stark contrast with the weathered condition of outdoor funeral monuments. Tiffany Studios. If you
Not to
could,
interrupt you,
yes,
purpose now, if you don't mind.
thanks.
Thank you.
All set.
If you should pay a visit to the Memorial Art Gallery and seek out Love's Mirror, you will, on your route, be confronted with an example of the beloved and familiar work of Louis Comfort Tiffany and Company. This vast and creative enterprise operated under various names through the years, but the works we're taking a look at today were created during the era of Tiffany Studios. This sunset scene, an elegant memorial window, was commissioned by Thomas B. Dunn for his family mausoleum in Mount Hope. For its long-term protection, the window was removed from its original location and donated for safekeeping to the Memorial Art Gallery by the Dunn family in 1993. The name Tiffany is, of course, synonymous with stained glass, and the use of such beautiful, naturally illuminated windows in mausoleums was wholly befitting. Windows, however, were not the sole funerary memorials the Tiffany Studios produced. As the advert here declares, Tiffany was prepared to provide you with mausoleums, tombs, headstones, and all forms of funerary monuments. Mount Hope has several Tiffany works. The austere, tasteful simplicity of the Gibbard monuments were also the work of Tiffany Studios. Mrs. Gibbard's matching stone replaces the stylized cross with a grouping of delicate lilies rendered in high relief. If you preferred something a bit more grand for your memorial, and by grand, I mean big, you could opt for something more akin to the Kuhn Monument. This 12-foot-high Art Deco monument by Tiffany Studios is the largest single stone monument in the cemetery, reportedly requiring a specially built railway car for transport. As I prepared for this presentation, I was momentarily confused to come across the Spencer Monument in DC's Oak Hill Cemetery. It's a rather striking resemblance, don't you think? The enormous Spencer Monument stands nearly 16 feet tall and 3 feet thick. James Dexter Havens, a Rochester native, trained as a painter, but would find his true calling as a printmaker. Winning acclaim as a woodcut artist, his works were published in many national magazines, most notably The American Artist. Considered part of the color woodblock revival in America, today his work can be found in numerous art collections, among them the Library of Congress, the Metropolitan Museum, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, and Rochester's own Memorial Art Gallery. Should you be unfamiliar with the technique, the woodcut artist carves an image into a wooden block, though various other media may today substitute for wood. The engraved image is rendered in reverse of the desired printed image, a sort of hand-wrought negative, if you will. These images here of carved block and a finished print, both the work of Havens, help illustrate the technique. Wood engraving is generally a black and white technique. However, some wood engravers also work in color. As a boy, James exhibited an affinity for art, and apart from his artistic inclination, he had a fairly unremarkable childhood until he was 14, at which time he was diagnosed with diabetes. This was at a time, 1914, when no treatment for his condition existed, and untreated, he spent years in decline. He managed to finish high school and completed 3 years at the University of Rochester, but at the age of 22, James was on the verge of death. His father, James Smith Havens, a former congressman and legal counsel at George Eastman's Kodak, agonized over his son's condition, and in fear for his life, sought out the aid of a Dr. Banting in Toronto. Banting agreed to a visit to Rochester and an examination of the young, gravely ill Havens. At the entreaty of the elder Havens, Dr. Banting administered what, up until that point, had been an experimental use of insulin. James Dexter Havens would be the first US patient to receive insulin as treatment for diabetes. His life was saved. I'll share with you a sampling of the work he would go on to create. Recall that while most wood engraving is rendered in black and white, some artists opted for color. The Cloverdale Garden Club flyers we just observed were each of a single color, one blue, the other red. Multicolor technique requires the use of separate blocks, one for each color. Success in this color technique demands that the printmaker register the blocks to make sure that they each print in exactly the same place on the page. Recently, engravers have begun to use lasers to engrave wood. The modern use of lasers gives one a sense of the precision this work requires. I love this glimpse of garden. I'm particularly fond of the hidden praying mantises in the blackberry briar. Can you see them? Havens would wed and become a father. He lived until the age of 60. The Print Club of Rochester uses to this day the Havens designed logo. I wanted it all, remembered William Warfield. I wanted Showboat and Porgy, Brahms, Fauré, the spirituals, the boogie woogie, and grand opera too. I wanted the Hollywood film, the bistro gig, the international tour, and the White House command performance. I wanted to teach. I wanted to play a role in world culture, not just Negro culture, not just Western European culture. I wanted all the wonders of music, a taste of everything that the muses had to offer. Born to a family of sharecroppers in Arkansas, William Warfield would win acclaim as one of the finest concert bass baritones of the 20th century. Just before he was to complete his undergraduate studies in vocal performance at the Eastman School of Music, Pearl Harbor was attacked and the US entered World War II. Warfield was drafted into the Army. Based on earned course credits prior to his call to service, the Eastman School conferred upon him a Bachelor of Music in 1942. Once completing basic training, Warfield was initially assigned to perform menial tasks in a segregated ordnance unit until he was able to convince his superior officers that his knowledge of German and Italian, language skills acquired in the course of his musical studies, made him better suited to assignment in an intelligence unit. The Ritchie Boys was just such a unit, an Army intelligence group made up of draftees and volunteers who were fluent in enemy languages. At Camp Ritchie in Maryland, they were specifically trained in methods of intelligence, counterintelligence, interrogation, investigation, and psychological warfare. Warfield was brought to the camp because of his strong German skills, but in an era of segregation, his skills were never put to use. After the war, the GI Bill provided Warfield the opportunity to earn a master's degree, but again, his coursework was interrupted by the national tour of a musical revue. Settling in New York City afterward, he continued his studies, gave concert performances, and was signed to a 3-month tour of Australia. While in Australia, he learned that MGM Studios was remaking the musical Showboat and seeking someone for the role of Joe. After receiving Warfield's audition recording and reviewing the rave notices that his prior concert performances had garnered, he was awarded the role and asked to report for filming at the conclusion of his Australian engagement. His scheduled recording of the show-stopping Old Man River number was legendarily done in a single take. A national and international tour of Gershwin's Porgy and Bess in 1952 would team him with legendary soprano Leontine Price. The two were wed shortly thereafter, separating in 1958, but not divorcing until 1972. There would be a steady demand for concert engagements, numerous television appearances, and recordings. In 1963, his album of selections from Porgy and Bess would earn him a Grammy nomination. In 1983, his spoken word contribution to the album Aaron Copland, A Lincoln Portrait, would earn him the prize. M. Louise Stowell, a painter, illustrator, craftsperson, and teacher, Stowell figured prominently in the Rochester art scene at the turn of the century. An accomplished watercolorist and graphics designer, she was heavily influenced by the Japanese aesthetic that infused much of the regional American arts and crafts movement. The striking beauty of line, of color, and harmonies she created are unparalleled, noted professor, curator, and museum consultant Patricia Tice on the occasion of a 2004 exhibition at RIT, where Stowell taught classes on and off for a number of years. Stowell made many paintings with allegorical subject matter and symbolic elements. Here, Philosophia, goddess of wisdom, sits on her throne. The profusion of pink flowers in the background representing goodness, the lily, purity and innocence. The biblical scene at right hardly requires explanation. In 1895, Stowell designed a poster for George Humphrey's bookstore. She entered her design in an international competition in Leipzig, Germany, the only American and the only woman among the entrants. She would receive honorable mention, and the design would be realized as a standard poster and in a smaller French edition. In 1896, she produced a poster commemorating the 70th anniversary of the local newspaper, the Union and Advertiser. Calvin Stowell, a brother to M. Louise, would build his own mausoleum in Mount Hope. His sister would contribute designs for the bronze doors and for a cycle of stained glass windows. The windows have tragically been lost to vandals. Among the Stowell holdings at the Memorial Art Gallery are 3 designs. While I found no proof that these are in fact preparatory renderings for those same windows, such does seem entirely plausible. Note in the middle the reimagined Philosophia that we viewed a moment ago. Stowell lived her entire life in her family home on Atkinson Street in the South Ward until she died at the age of 69. While the name on her gravestone records her name as Mary, census data refers to her as Minnie. Her death certificate refers to Marie. And in the absence of a birth certificate, we might well agree that the M stands for nothing quite so much as mystery. Or, as suggested by journalist Marcia Morphy, perhaps M stands for mastery. Fletcher Steele. Before there was such a thing as landscape architecture, there was Fletcher Steele, a landscape architect, credited with designing and creating over 700 gardens from 1915 to the time of his death. Fletcher recounted how, as a boy, his mother was struck by a scene of nature, commenting how beautiful a nearby hilly area looked. She sought the validation of her young son, who replied, "Not specially," as he was irritated by an abrupt drop in the hill, which interrupted the flow of the landscape. From then on, he constantly evaluated and examined landscapes around him. Educated at Williams College and Harvard University, Steele would study under the great Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of New York's Central Park and Rochester's Genesee Valley Park, Highland Park, Seneca Park, and Maplewood Park. His early garden plans are generally in the English style, ornamented with Italianate detailing such as balustrades, hedges, urns, as illustrated on the left, and an early restrained, highly formalized small garden design for Charlotte Whitney Allen in Rochester. His design evolution would take him on a decidedly more modernist approach to design, as evidenced on the right by his blue steps for the New York City lawyer Joseph Hodges Choate's Stockbridge, Massachusetts country home. Note the interplay of the white painted railing with the birch plantings. Steele designed his family plot in Mount Hope, a favorite of mine for its simple and subtly subversive design. The black slate markers stand in stark contrast to the ethos of the rural Victorian cemetery ideal. They harken back to the burial grounds and graveyards from which the cemetery would evolve. A casual passerby might well assume the markers among the oldest to be found in Mount Hope. That assumption would be incorrect. The original Gannett plot in the cemetery was a landscape designed by Steele. It features a large terrace of black obsidian mosaic in which is set a massive Celtic knot, an often used symbol of infinity having no discernible beginning nor end. Claude Bragdon. The knot, as symbolic mortuary ornament, is found throughout Mount Hope, and perhaps no designer made better use of it than architect, writer, and stage designer Claude Bragdon. Bragdon's contributions to Rochester's architecture include the original New York Central Railroad station, sadly demolished, and the Rochester First Universalist Church, among other buildings. His passion for inventive, organic, and geometric ornamentation is documented in a number of published works. Bragdon created a universal form language based on mathematical patterns abstracted from nature. His design for the Watson plot features a profusion of individual knot elements. Note the knot rendered over 90 degrees, the one folded over the edges of James Watson's stone on the right. As well as stylized rosettes rendered in multiple distinctive forms.
Chris, we're going to switch the interpreters now.
Okay.
Thank you.
His bronze details for Antoinette Perkins' monument also explore this rosette form. Here, a geometric ink rendering from his treatise Projective Ornament hints at the evolution of his design philosophy. I'm particularly fond of his playful, decorative animal figures, the fish, the fowl. The carved bird in the lower right is a detail from Emily Sibley Watson's stone slab marker that we just viewed. Among the many Celtic crosses to be found in Mount Hope, this Bragdon monument for Rufus Sibley is a favorite. The acanthus leaves are framed in a meandering serpentine detail terminating in Celtic stylized dog heads at its base. Sallie James Farnum. Lorado Taft's landmark volume, The History of American Sculpture, published in 1924, makes mention of, quote, the intrepid Mrs. Sallie James Farnum, self-taught, without master or tradition, unquote. Born Sarah Wells James in 1869 in a small town in upstate New York, she was encouraged in her love of hunting and celebrated for her horsemanship. She was equally fond of fashioning exacting paper cutout silhouettes of people and animals. Years later, after marrying, a serious illness would, for a period of time, confine her to a hospital bed. Her husband had the idea of bringing her some modeling clay, hoping that it would engage her and elevate her depressed spirits. She took to it readily. It was as if, in some mysterious previous state of existence, I had actually been a sculptor, and the memory of it was beginning to leak back into my fingers and thumbs, she later recalled. With her health at last restored, she would avidly pursue her newfound passion, receiving encouragement from the likes of famed sculptor Frederick Remington. Her first important private commission in 1903 was to create a fountain for a Baltimore garden. Working in a flamboyant beaux art style, she rendered a trio of dancing nymphs in the nude below a child figure of Pan, a figure that she based on her young son. With a humor that defied any potential accusations of impropriety, she had a poem inscribed on the fountain's base. Why should maidens, stiffly bodiced, stand the type of all that's modest, or the consciousness of virtue be expressed by shoes that hurt you? Her work for Mount Hope is the centerpiece and crowning glory of the Civil War Memorial, Defenders of the Flag. The evocative depiction of a weary flag-bearing Union soldier and bugle boy at rest is the third monument, along with the two Papodi works receiving regularly scheduled preservation attention. Here we have a detail of that war-weary soldier. Numerous of her works exist today in cemeteries throughout the Northeast and in public parks. Here, she poses next to her monumental sculpture of Simon Bolivar, which stands in New York's Central Park. J. Guernsey Mitchell. Rochester artist Guernsey Mitchell was a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and made his home abroad for 21 years. Among his best-known works are the statue of Martin B. Anderson, former president of the University of Rochester, which now stands on the campus of the university. His statue of Eugene M. Wilson, famous Minnesota lawyer, and works depicting Aurora, the young botanist, and David and Goliath. In 1881, Guernsey Mitchell was commissioned by his brother-in-law, William Kemble, to create a decoration for his new tobacco factory's smokestack, the Kemble Tobacco Factory. The resulting bronze statue of Mercury was described as the largest copper-plated statue in America at the time. The factory, located at the corner of Court and Exchange Streets, would be demolished for the Community War Memorial. In 1951, the 21-foot-tall, 700-pound statue was removed, loaded onto a truck, and stored in a Charlotte warehouse for 22 years. After which, it was finally resurrected and reinstalled atop the Lawyers Aqueduct building in 1973. I was unable to locate a marker for Mr. Mitchell in his recorded plot. I find it ironic that no personal monument should exist, as his monument of Mercury remains a distinctive feature on the Rochester skyline to this day. Robert Everhard Launitz. Born into a Russian military family, Launitz's destiny seemed assured. He received a classical and military education in training for a military career. His interest in art would not be denied, however, and at the suggestion of an uncle, he went to Rome to study under the internationally renowned Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. Launitz would contract scarlet fever while in Rome, and the illness would leave him deaf. He settled in New York in 1828, fluent in 5 European languages, deaf, and with no knowledge of English. He would join the sculpting workshop of John Frazee as a journeyman. With an undeniable artistic skill and the ability to communicate with a variety of European immigrant workers in Frazee's employ, Launitz was soon made a partner in the enterprise. Launitz created the commemorative stone for the state of New York that is installed on the interior walls of the Washington Monument in DC, as well as numerous monuments memorializing war heroes, 2 of which we see here. The nature of these works makes his contribution to Mount Hope all the more tender. Commissioned by Judge Samuel Lee Selden to memorialize his young son, Henry. Henry drowned tragically as his father had taught to teach him to swim in Irondequoit Bay. Launitz's work here is profoundly personal and intimate. A relief depicting the young boy's pupil, a text carried in his left hand. He leans on a symbolic stump representing a life cut short, with vining morning glories, yet another symbol of life's brevity. One today can only imagine the work as it originally appeared. One might imagine Launitz working from a daguerreotype image of the child, realizing a lifelike depiction. Time and the elements have been most unkind to the memorial. but the emotion of the work is no less palpable today. Jessie Bonstell. Born in Greece, New York, the youngest of 8 children, Jessie Bonstell was a theater artist, an actress, director, and company manager. Trained for the theater by her mother, her first public performance was singing temperance songs in church at the age of 2. At 10, she was touring in theatrical productions. After the death of her parents in 1890, Bonstell relocated to New York City. She performed in 3 productions on Broadway, one of which in 1913 she self-produced. Her greatest contributions to the theater would come from her role as teacher, training the likes of Katharine Cornell, still regarded as one of the greatest actresses of the American stage. Bonstell would direct Cornell in a London production of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Bonstell is credited with discovering such Hollywood stars as Melvyn Douglas, William Powell, and the Wizard of Oz himself, Frank Morgan. She founded one of the first civic theaters in the US, the Detroit Civic Theater. Acquired by Wayne State University, the theater was rechristened the Bonstell Theater and to this day serves as the university's theater department playhouse. To close, I present this small gallery of female artists interred in Mount Hope, whose careers in performance and literature provide us with little in the way of visual aid. Lucy Lee Call, one of the original members of the voice faculty at the Eastman School of Music, a member of the Metropolitan Opera Company from 1905, Ms. Call came to Rochester in 1919, beginning a teaching career that would span 30 years. After a long tenure as part of the University of Rochester faculty, she rests today alongside the grave of Rush Rees in the cemetery's University of Rochester plot. Enid Knapp Orcutt. This native of Maryland moved to Rochester after her father's death. She was a student of dance in New York City under the great Anna Pavlova. She returned to Rochester in 1922 and, with the support of George Eastman, brought ballet to the recently opened Eastman Theater, launching a launching a career in staging and teaching dance in Rochester that would last for more than 60 years. It was at the invitation of Miss Orcutt that Mikhail Baryshnikov visited Rochester in 1981. Baroness Catherine Evans von Klenner. A native Rochesterian, she had a varied career: voice teacher, author, lecturer, journalist. Music was the center of her life, however. In Paris, she studied voice. In 1895, Catherine Evans married Baron Rudolf Ferdinand August Maria von Klenner. In 1937, Baroness von Klenner urged Congress to declare February a month of tribute to American composers and musicians. Most of her life was spent as a teacher of voice and music. The Baroness initiated dollar opera for the multitudes in an effort to develop a greater audience for opera. And lastly, an author and poet who worked in the genre of science fiction, Duverne Conrick Farsace. I know little of her story and was unable to discover a portrait, but I was intrigued by Duverne. I'm sure the fact that she hailed from Jasper, Texas, a stone's throw from my very own birthplace in deep East Texas, helped spark my fascination with her. I'd like to close with a poem written by this female mid-century sci-fi poet as she witnessed the birth of the space age and anticipated man's exploration of the cosmos. Walk in space. A myriad cold, unwinking eyes are staring in the black and silent depths of outer space. Man trembles on the threshold of the cosmos and mysteries long veiled from his mad race. These watchers of the skies, aloof, uncaring, are they indifferent to man's fiery span? Or are they wary guardians, watchful, waiting to save the universe from the taint of man? The world and its revolution seem to vanish as I stand alone in infinity, chartless, vast. There seems to be no red and violent present, no obscure future, no corroding past. Is man the catalyst of new tomorrows, the builder of new frontiers where the stars entice? Or is the cosmic atom about to savor a knowledge that will yield a fearful price? Thank you so much, everyone.
Chris, there is a question in the chat that says, are the Papati monuments made out of marble?
They are marble.
Are there other questions at this point in time? Feel free to unmute yourself. You're also welcome to turn on your cameras. And Chris is happy to take questions. Chris, if you'd like, you can also unshare your screen so that folks can see you. Are there any more questions?
Hi, Nancy. Nancy Uffendell. I want to give you a shout out. She actually clued me in to J. Guernsey Mitchell. You wouldn't be looking at him today if she hadn't brought him to my attention.
Wonderful. Well, if there are no questions, I want to thank you, Chris, for a wonderful presentation, and look for us back again next month with yet another presentation in the Mourning series. You'll find that on the library events calendar and also on Facebook.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.